years ago, the Banco Delta Asia was caught being the conduit for counterfeit $100 bills being sold from North Korea. And as a consequence, our Treasury Department shut down that bank and other banks that were discovered being used for hard currency by North Korea at the time. The result was very successful in the sense that they did not have the hard currency to pay for the missile program that otherwise, was accelerating. They didn't have the money for the nuclear weapons program. And we talked to defectors who confirmed this at the time. Also, the dictator did not have the money to pay his generals, which is not a good position for a dictator to be in. So we had a lot of pressure from the State Department to lift the sanctions. There were certain promises that had been made, but were not kept by North Korea. So the sanctions were lifted and they were able to restart these missile programs again. What we're discussing right now is shutting down that hard currency in the same way we did then, by putting pressure on these financial institutions that are the ones used by North Korea. They lifted it because they believed when the North Korean regime said, if you lift it, we will stop our program, we'll come to the table, we'll start negotiating. And we found out subsequently that rather than working with the international community, they were secretly, as soon as they got the cash again, they were applying the cash to building out the nuclear weapons program. We also learned that this was the source for building out that program, was getting this hard currency from overseas, because they have to buy these parts on the international market, and even what they develop internally, it's tremendously expensive. I've passed legislation, and not only did the United States pass the legislation, but the Security Council at the United Nations also passed a similar measure. And in the Security Council, all the permanent members and other Security Council members signed off on this. So we actually have at our disposal a tremendous amount of leverage that we can bring and should bring. I'm advising the administration on this. I've had an opportunity to talk to our Secretary of State, Tillerson, about it directly, and of course I'll be, next month I will be in Korea to talk again at further length with the government about it. We want to do this in conjunction and diplomatically with the government in Seoul, with the government in Beijing, to make sure that all of us ratchet up the pressure. Because it's gotten to the point where it's not in the interest of any government any longer to have Kim Jong-un develop this capability. I was in favor of using that against Kim Jong-il at the time, because at that time I'd actually been to Macau and seen the effect of using the counterfeit currency, but I'd also talked with one of the defectors out of the missile program after it happened, and another senior defector who told me how much money was going into this weapons program. I thought it was a mistake to lift it, and I spoke out against that. And it was both Democrats and it was some Republicans. It was the then Secretary of State, Condi Rice, in the Bush administration that I believe pushed to lift it. And as I recall, those of us in the House of Representatives who had more familiarity with the issue were saying, wait a minute, let's keep the pressure on. And I think in retrospect, some of the administration senior officials who were involved in the negotiations themselves felt that maybe we made an error in terms of the way we approached North Korea. What we have to be careful of is being too gullible, because North Korea has repeatedly violated any representations that they've made to Seoul or to Washington or even to Beijing, and they go right back to their old conduct regardless of what they say. They did cut down coal, but I think they increased oil. So China has a very important role to play because China, as a neighbor with North Korea, has a close relationship traditionally. And China could do a lot more, obviously, to help prevent North Korea from moving forward on the nuclear weapons program. And what we are diplomatically asking China to do, and what the United Nations Security Council is pressuring China to do, is to put this condition on their support for North Korea so that we can cut off the kind of funding that goes right into the nuclear weapons program. The strategy is, if they do not have the funds to pay their generals, nor the money to pay for the build-out of the ICBM program, then we can finally get them to a position where we can have a discussion with inspections from international inspectors. And so these are the discussions we're having right now with Beijing. Part of the pressure is to ask them to withhold the export of oil, since that is used to the advantage of the regime. It would be powerful, but the one thing I've seen that worked was the Banco Delta Asia sanctions. Those really work. And so I want to make certain that we do go forward with that program. And I also have legislation in the Senate right now that we're waiting for this bill to come up that would also curtail the ability of countries such as the Gulf states in the Middle East, who take workers from North Korea, and instead of paying the workers, they only feed the worker. Checks go instead to the regime. And that money is used for the nuclear weapons program. So we want to also curtail that activity, also because it violates every rule in terms of workers' rights. They did that at a time when they were building out their weapons program. Now, in retrospect, we know that they were also doing, besides the enriched uranium program, they also had a plutonium program. They had a two-track program. So at a time when they were coming back to the table and saying, all right, we'll put a brake on this, they were actually pushing both programs. Like you, I question why we haven't moved sooner on this, because we've waited this out. And the fact is that they just continue to build forward towards their goal. And that's why I think the international community is now so focused that these resolutions are passing the United Nations Security Council now. You know, I see it as a failure not just of the strategic patience strategy of the Obama administration, but also of the Bush administration in failing to move on this and in lifting sanctions at a time when we now know in retrospect that we had temporarily shut down their missile program as a consequence of those sanctions. We're going to have to use this strategy, because this and one other strategy which would be helpful. You know, the dramas that appear in South Korea are now popular all over the world, including here. And people usually watch them here with subtitles. But in North Korea, when those dramas come over the border from China, people watch them with great interest. And maybe 20% of the people now in North Korea have those inexpensive players, you know, inexpensive equipment where they can watch. So there's another way to influence people in North Korea. And that is with the shortwave radio, but also these dramas that are so popular in South Korea and around the world now. People watch South Korean dramas, and they're very, very popular among those people in North Korea who have obtained equipment so that they can watch these. And it's an increasingly surprising number of people that want access to this, as well as shortwave radio, so they can find out what's going on in the outside world. It's important that even the leadership in North Korea have access to know what's really going on. The senior military personnel and also to see what life is like in other countries, including South Korea. I saw it work in East Germany because we had a situation where a majority of the people had concerns about their totalitarian regime, but more and more that expanded out to even including people within the government and within the military who began to put pressure for reforms. And just what I was seeing happening there was also happening in Poland and in Czechoslovakia. So over time, this changed the circumstances. We need to give people access to more information in North Korea. Well, I don't know that it would necessarily be a coup per se, because what I saw happen in Eastern Europe was pressure applied to the point where even many inside the government began to say, look, we need changes. And they applied the pressure to bring about change internally. Now, our foremost problem is going to be the question of the nuclear weapons program and how we cut off the hard currency to that. But I think long term, it's in our interest to try to get more information into the people. Well, I'm one of the co-sponsors of the U.S.-Korea trade agreement, and it's been very beneficial to California. And let me just give you an example. CJ Foods here in Fullerton, they established their business with about 70 employees right before or about the time that KORUS went into effect. Today they have 270 employees in Fullerton, and they ship all over the United States and all over the world. It's been a win-win in terms of economic activity, and especially for California. Now, with any trade agreement, there might be issues that we need to discuss. There might be some specific thing that we want to address. But the overall agreement, in terms of effectiveness, I believe has been very effective for California. And I would also say that, you know, those of us in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, we have a major role to play here in terms of keeping the United States engaged, keeping us engaged, you know, across Asia and across the world. And I think we'll continue to be focused on international trade as a objective for creating more employment, more opportunity for people here in California. I have talked to senior administration officials who have the responsibility over this area about the issues of international trade and how we can move forward to try to keep the momentum moving forward to create more synergy, more opportunity. And, you know, as I said, if there's a specific issue that needs to be discussed, we can always discuss that issue and try to fix that issue. But I'd like to keep part of the focus on maintaining the momentum for more international trade. And just as I mentioned, in terms of the jobs created here by CJ Foods, there are so many different examples in California of companies that are hiring, are expanding, and trade's a part of it. I think it's too early to know how this will play out, but I think it needs to be a primary focus of foreign policy. It's one of the reasons I'm leading a delegation to Korea, to Seoul, to have further discussions on this. We've been very active moving legislation out of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and we want to hear from our counterparts in the National Assembly, and I want to discuss this in greater detail with President Moon. But to our audience out there, annyeonghaseyo. I look forward to our trip to Seoul. I lead a delegation. I try to lead a delegation every year. I've been going to Korea for 20 years now, and have very much enjoyed the deepening relationship between the United States and South Korea. Thank you very much.